I'm standing at one of the gates to the family lot of Howell and Mary Ann Lamar Cobb. When Howell Cobb died in 1868, his funeral was held at the chapel on the university campus because it had the greatest seating capacity of any building in Athens. And we know from the obituary in the Athens paper that the cortege then made its way over to Oconee Hill Cemetery where he was buried. What we don't know, because of the loss of 40 years of our earliest records, is where he was buried that day. He was not buried here that day because this lot didn't exist. A year or so later, his wife, his widow, and her brother-in-law, Williams Rutherford, a mathematics professor at the university who was also a civil engineer, came over and looked at this bluff above the Oconee River, and he surveyed it, and she purchased it from the trustees. They had never laid it out into burial lots because it was a very precipitous bluff down to the river. But Mary Ann had stonemasons come in and build massive retaining walls with flying buttresses to support them, and they all appear to be in very good condition to this day. And then she had the grave of her husband, Howell Cobb, moved into the center of this lot, and she went back to Milledgeville where they had buried 2 young children and brought their graves here because she knew the concept of uniting the family in one burial lot. So there are very old stones on the back of the lot for the little children. She bought this cast iron fence with a gate for each of their adult children. The gates are missing now, and they may be in storage over here at the cemetery, but each gate had the name of an adult child on it. And she subdivided the big lot into sections for each of her adult children. And she and Howell are buried in the central portion of the lot. Howell Cobb was the most distinguished Georgian of the 19th century. He was a governor of Georgia. He was a congressman. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. He and his wife helped President Buchanan host at the White House. There are many letters that give information about their doing this. And then when the Civil War was inevitable, he signed up for the Confederate Army and became a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. At first, he was with the Army in Northern Virginia, but then after the loss of his brother-in-law, who really managed the Lamar and the Cobb properties, Howell came back to Georgia and was in Florida also, managing the foodstuffs of the South, feeding the Confederate Army, and did great service there. This is his son, Howell, who never used Junior to his name because he was only 26 when his daddy died, so he was just Howell Cobb also. And his obituary says that he was buried in his Confederate uniform, that he still fit in it, and we just have many Confederate soldiers buried in this lot, including Alexander Smith Irwin, who married the Cobb daughter, Mary Ann. I could talk about this lot for the rest of the day, but we will stop at this point. When the Secession Convention was held in Montgomery, Alabama, Howell Cobb presided over it because he was the Southerner of highest national rank, having just been Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. This is Howell Cobb's great-great-grandson, Milton Leathers, And he has an anecdote passed on to him by his mother, which he is going to share with us.
Well, it's my favorite Howell Cobb story, and the only one I made our children memorize. I'm sure they've forgotten it by now. But when Howell Cobb was being interviewed on the steps of the State House in Montgomery, Alabama, by a newspaper reporter from Washington, D.C., and when Lincoln had been elected, Howell Cobb had national ambitions. He wanted to be a U.S. president, so he was a Unionist. He had made enemies in Georgia. That's one reason he wasn't elected president of the Confederacy, because he was a Unionist, wanted to hold the country together, worked on the Compromise of 1850 and all of that. But when Lincoln was elected, he knew that he came home and joined his brother in preaching secession. And nowadays we think they were wrong about that, but they were living by the life they had. So he's interviewed on the steps of the State House in Montgomery, Alabama, because he's president of the convention that forms the Confederate States. And the newspaper reporter addresses him as Mr. Secretary, because he just left Washington. Said, "Mr. Secretary, do you see any way of averting war with the North?" And Howell Cobb said, "Only two things stand in the way now of an amicable settlement of the entire difficulty: the landing of the Pilgrims and original sin."